Hey guys, Teresa here. Welcome back to my channel, Lost My Thread. I'm here today to talk about the sewing process with part 3 of my latest Clash of the Pattern series, the Fancy Pants Fracas. I have been busy here in my sewing room and I'm excited to report that I have completed not one, not two, but 3 pairs of trousers that are all fully sewn up and fully wearable. I'm not going to be showing you what these trousers are like on me today because I haven't actually had much opportunity to wear them. I've just completed the finished pair yesterday. It's a really rainy day, so I know I'm not going to be able to get any photos today. I would love to be able to put out the final part of this series next week, but honestly it all depends on if the weather is on my side when I have days off to see if I can get some good proper photos. But you will be seeing the finished photo soon. Today really though is probably my favorite part of this video series where I really delve into the nitty-gritty details of the sewing. That's what we're all here for, right? The sewing, and that's definitely my favorite part of the process. So if you are not familiar with the Clash of the Pattern series, in the first video in this series, I introduced the patterns, talked about how they are different as far as the design details. I shared the fabrics that I was choosing for each of them and talked about why I paired them together. In the second part of the series, it was round 1 where I was comparing the fit of each of them. I made a muslin of each based on what I could see from the finished garment measurements from the patterns. And then today we're getting all into the construction methods, the instructions, how the different pattern companies explain different things, how satisfying these things were to put together. And then in the next video in the series, I will reveal the finished trousers, talking about how they feel to wear, how they fit into my wardrobe, and which one of them is my overall favorite. Now, just to remind you where we were at the end of the first round, we had the Mitchell trousers by Closet Core in the first place. In second place was the Rose pants from Made by Rae, and in third place were the Taylor trousers from BF Patterns. None of them were standout bad, it was just how much they needed to be adjusted to fit me, and I'm really excited to talk through all the different elements of putting these together and seeing who's sitting on the top of the leaderboard at the end. I'm going to start by talking about just the overall level of instructions, how satisfying these were to construct, and I'm going to start with the Rose pants. Now I will say these had really impressive instructions. I'd be very curious to try more of Made by Rae's patterns because I really did enjoy putting these together. Now I will say these are also the simplest of the 3 pairs of trousers, so I am aware of that, but what I saw was telling me that had they been a little bit more detailed, I would have felt equally confident putting their patterns together. There was some excellent details that I really liked, so their overall style of instruction is my favorite type of sewing instruction, where you have one little step with a clear diagram to show you what it is that you're doing, depending on, you know, whether you're more of a visual looking at images or reading type person, you're gonna get what you need. But also I think having the combination sometimes clarifies things if it gets a little bit unclear. I felt like the level of detail was really good. I feel like if you were more of like a advanced beginner or wanting to try a bit of a challenge, I think you could easily sew this pattern up. But there were some details that stood out to me that I especially liked. One thing that is a small thing but I think made a big difference was pre-pressing the waistband before you stitched it in place. So the front waistband gets folded down and then top stitched from the outside, and I really liked that you pressed it before you'd actually installed it. It's the kind of thing where if you try and do it later on, it's just a bit more fiddly, and I appreciate that they thought ahead. They also had a load of what I am calling bonus diagrams. So basically images of instructions that you and I might take for granted if we've been sewing for a while, but if you are more of a beginner, I think these would be so invaluable. They had a diagram about how to make a muslin to test the fit, diagrams of how to adjust the rise and the length of the trouser. They had diagrams of how to move the pleats around, different options of what you might want to do with the pleats, and also a whole section on seam finishes with really clear images of how to do each of those. I was really impressed with that. They also had something that I rarely see in other patterns, but always makes me really happy when I do, which is a one-page summary of how to construct these pants from start to finish. Now, this is fantastic if you are an experienced sewist. You don't need the diagrams, you just need a really brief description of, sew front to back, sew top to bottom, and you can just follow along and put these pants together without any problems. I felt like those would have been super clear, especially if you've made them before, but like I said, if you're a bit of an experienced sewist, you can probably get away with using those instructions. And it's just really nice to have the option of just having it right there, work through it. You don't have to faff around and find the right page. Always a really nice detail. Moving on then to the tailor trousers. Now, these are a more complicated pair of trousers, and it is definitely difficult to make some of these instructions clear. I feel like on the whole, they were okay. I think there was a little bit to be desired in some of the elements. The overall instructions, I would say, were really good. So looking at the way they're laid out, very similar to the rose pants, we had a short description of what you needed to do, followed by a really clear diagram showing what that is. But this had a one-up on the rose pants because it also had the pattern piece number in the instruction. I will say I often just label my pattern pieces with the number of the pattern piece, and so probably that's why I appreciate that extra step, but it can be confusing sometimes to figure out if you've got the right piece that they're referring to, and so to me that just makes it a little bit more clear, and I always appreciate it. I did run into a little bit of a sticky point when I was actually putting my PDF patterns together, because there are some pieces that you're meant to cut out of your PDF and then tape them to each other to create a longer piece. And I didn't see that on the pattern piece. I didn't see it in the instructions. I was really confused, and I actually emailed the pattern company to ask what I'm supposed to do. And it looks like there were some instructions to attach one piece to the other, but it was actually attached to one of the sizes on the PDF pattern that I had removed when I was printing just my size. So basically it was an error on the PDF. Once I knew what I needed to do, I put those pieces together and it was absolutely fine, but it was definitely something that you could get caught out if you don't realize those pieces are meant to be joined up. There is a little flower on the edge of each of the piece, or half of a flower, so you can see that that's meant to be joined onto the other half. On the whole, the construction process was very satisfying. I really enjoyed putting in the zipper fly. I feel like that was a really nice method. It came out really neatly. I had no moments where I was scratching my head. I also enjoyed putting the pockets together. That was really satisfying, the way everything kind of slotted into place. The one problem that I had was the welt pockets on the back. Now, these are an optional detail and I did want to make them, and largely I think it was okay. They had some nice tips about how to get some neat corners of your welt pockets, which I appreciated. There was one part of the instructions that I had a real head scratcher that I actually had to just put the pattern down and go to bed and then try and tackle it the next day. And I do think there's some stitching that was meant to be on the inside of the trouser that ended up more visible on the outside. And that is down to me not fully understanding what the instructions were telling me. So I do think there were some bits that, hard to say, was it user error? Was it me? Was it the instructions? But clearly there was a bit of a disconnect, and I don't think that it was the best method of welt pocket construction that I have done. I've made a fair few welt pockets before, but these ones were not my favorite. There was also one part of the welt pocket construction where it had you hand based, and I thought I was just hand basting just to keep all the layers really neatly together, but it turns out I was meant to be actually using my hand basting line as a guide for my stitch line later, which I hadn't realized. And if I had noticed that, I would have stitched it much more neatly and right close to the edge of my stitch line. But again, that is possibly I should have read ahead, but I think they could have made that more clear in the instructions. There were lots of areas where I feel like there was a good amount of detail if you are not super familiar with trouser construction, if you haven't done a lot of these processes before. But one example where I feel like things were not quite as clear was at one stage it told you that you needed to make some bar tacks, but it didn't explain what bar tacks were. They were not in the glossary, and I will say if I was newer to sewing, I would have felt a little bit lost and had to go use my friend Google to work out what bar tacks are. So again, I don't think this pattern is for a beginner, but I definitely think if you're intermediate, if you have made some more basic trousers before, I think you will be absolutely fine in making these. And like I said, I've got some beautiful finished trousers in the end. So even though it took me a moment with some of the instructions, especially if you leave the welt pockets off, I don't think you'll have any problems. The Mitchells had some really fantastic instructions. So in addition to having the short description of each step in the instructions with a diagram and the pattern number in the instructions, which you know I love, they also had the pattern number on the diagrams. Not every single diagram, just when you were first joining two pieces together, and especially in places where it might not be super clear which piece is which. That for me is just like the ultimate. All the heart emojis definitely makes me really happy, and it makes it so obvious when you're feeling a little bit unsure if you've got the right pieces matching together. I also appreciated they had the welt pockets pretty early on in the instructions. Again, these are optional. I wanted to make welt pockets, but I decided to do just one as a bit of a design detail that I thought would be interesting because they suggested that as a possibility. I have to say, I really enjoyed making this welt pocket. It was so satisfying, and I started to wonder if maybe I should add a second welt pocket just because I really liked making the first one, but I thought, no, I'm just gonna go with my original design and what I wanted to do. But seriously, guys, this was my favorite welt pocket construction that I have ever done. It was really clear. Everything felt super neat and satisfying when it came together. Everything just lined up really beautifully, and it was really obvious when I needed to do what I needed to do. They did also have a step just to join the things together where you could either hand-baste or use pins. I used pins. It was definitely fine, and I am happy with how this one came out. It is a slightly shorter welt pocket than the Mitchell, than the Taylor, sorry. And I actually really like this welt pocket. I feel like there's something really neat and pretty about it. The other one feels a little bit more chunky by comparison, and I feel like this is the welt pocket that I want to use forever now. The front pockets, on the other hand, were definitely a bit more of a challenge and a bit confusing to put together. I did have to pause and read these instructions a couple of times. There was a bit where you were attaching the pocket piece onto the trouser leg, but it didn't go to the very top of the trouser leg. And then you were meant to finish the pocket, but I wasn't sure if you were meant to finish the seam beyond the pocket up to the rest of the top of the trouser leg. I think you were in the end, which is what I did. But well and truly, I'm not even sure if that was what I was supposed to do. And there were parts where things were kind of getting folded back and overlapping when you were creating the top of the pocket bag that I'm not even 100% sure that I lined up exactly how I was meant to do it. But it turned out well, and so I'm gonna go with it. So I feel like there was a bit of kind of trusting the process, and I wouldn't have minded maybe a little bit more help at that particular stage. This was the only pattern as well that suggested putting some twill tape into the angled hip pocket just to help stabilize it and prevent gaping. I did do that step just on these trousers. I mean, to be fair, none of them gaped. They all turned out okay, but I appreciate the suggestion, the extra step. I also found the zipper fly really satisfying and nice to construct on this one. I had absolutely no problems. It all came together really nice and neatly. I did appreciate one extra detail with this one when you're putting the hook and bar in, that they suggested to put a vertical pin where you want the bar to be so that it will attach onto the hook in the right place. This is something that I've had a problem with numerous times, and I have often had my bar in the wrong spot, and I'm trying my best to like hold it in place about where I want it to line up. And then of course, as soon as you take the trousers off, you move around, the bar just moves out of the spot. And so it's really hard to know where to put it. I thought this was just a really nice extra tip. Now, I have had a problem before with trousers where the seam along the back crotch has split open. And so for my own peace of mind, I now put a little bit of reinforcement stitching just along the back crotch. And I did that on the other two patterns, but this one had it in the instructions. So the whole back crotch, you were meant to go 1 millimeter just inside with a short stitch length to go along to reinforce it. I was so happy to see that. And like I said, I did it on the other patterns myself before I sewed this one up. And I felt like that little extra detail, just going that little extra mile, really makes a difference for me. So in addition to the basic instructions, all of these patterns did also have some extra information that you could get just to help you a bit more along the way. The Mitchell trousers had quite a lot on the Closet Core website. Because it's not their first pants pattern, there were some just general things that they have from previous pants patterns that you can refer to. So they had a pants fitting guide, which is super helpful if you're not sure if pants are not quite fitting you right, what kind of adjustments you might need to make. They also had a whole tutorial that was more like a photograph tutorial that can be helpful in some situations for welt pockets and for the zipper fly, which is a really nice extra. I would have appreciated that kind of photograph tutorial, or better yet, a video tutorial of how to put together the pleat pocket combination, because like I said, I'm not even sure that I did it exactly how I was meant to. It works, so I'm going with it, but I feel like that is the bit that's the most unusual about this pattern, and that is the bit that I really needed that extra hand holding for. There were also some elements of the instructions that were marked as important, and generally that was when something was maybe a little bit different than typical construction, so that way you don't just kind of just go off assuming you know what you need to do, that you're going to kind of take a step back and make sure that you pause and follow the instructions as they've given them. They also gave you some really great tips about how you can get a neater finish, and it was nice to be able to use some of those in my garment. The tailors had what they called their Byrdie tips, which I thought was pretty cute, and those were basically little tips along the way of things that you might not have thought of. There were some different options of the seam finishing, of the constructions, some things a little bit more simplified if you want to go a simpler route, and then also if you wanted to get more of a neat finish, what you might want to do to go that extra mile. They did also have on their website, on the Blackbird Fabrics website, suggested fabrics, and there's specific fabrics that you can order from their fabric shop, but obviously you do not need to buy them from their shop. You could just look at the suggested fabrics, get an idea of what the fabrics are like, the weights, the drapes, the types of fabrics, and then buy them elsewhere. But I do think picking the right fabric for the pattern is one of the hardest parts of sewing, and so I like that that option is there. Rose had the most extra on their website. So again, if you are a beginner, you're going to do really well to sew this one up and find all the extra resources available. So they had a whole blog post on how to put together a PDF pattern. They had a full photograph tutorial if you prefer photos, so that you can follow along all the steps of the process. They had a whole blog post on taking measurements for trousers, on how to pick the right fabrics for the trousers, and they had images of the trousers sewn up in different types of fabric to give you an idea of what they might look like. Really impressed with all the extras. They also added a little important note on one of the steps where you were putting the waistband in place. If you had a pattern fabric, which way round you want to sew it in so that the pattern is going to be facing the right direction. Really nice detail. Now I want to get into the drafting. There are different parts of pattern drafting, and I think what most people think about is, can you make the size that you're intending to based on the recommended sizes from the size charts? And generally I will say these were all successful, which you would have seen in my previous video. I did have to make some minor adjustments, so I did end up lengthening the back rise on the rose pants by 3/4 of an inch, and I did end up doing my 1.5 inch full seat adjustment on my tailor trousers. Again, I'll put a link to the blog post where it explains how to do both of those adjustments. The full seat adjustment looks really overcomplicated, but you just snip into the pattern pieces in some very specific points, and it's just shifting all at one time and taping it down, and I was really happy with the outcome there. So that one did take 3 muslins, but realistically guys, trousers, it is rare that they're going to fit you right out of the packet. I did not go in with the expectation that they were just going to fit me straight away. We know that our bodies, particularly the lower half of the bodies, we've got complex curves in 3D. So it's rare that they're going to fit really well, and I had no concerns with these fitting. I know somebody with a different body type might have had a perfect fit with the tailors and not with the others, but on the whole I was happy with the sizes at least fitting what the patterns were suggesting. As far as the other drafting details, I'm going to start with Rose, which again was the more simple pattern, but I could see those little details I feel like really do make a difference. So for example, on the pocket pieces, there was a slight angle to the bottom of one of the pieces, so that way when everything folded up, it was all going to be sitting nice and straight along the seam. I also really felt like the elastic channels at the back were exactly the right size. I've had a lot of issues at times where they are so precise. If you do not sew the perfect line, your elastic doesn't fit through. And I've had ones where there's just so much room either side, everything is just kind of knocking around. But I feel like these ones came together really nicely. The 2 channels, my elastic went through, everything went through without any problem. It's sitting really nice and beautifully. I feel like just on the whole, the drafting was impeccable with this pattern. Rose had the least amount of notches, which I feel like is possibly just because it had the least amount of pattern pieces. Mitchell definitely had the most notches, and that is a pretty common thing I know for closet core patterns. But I have to say, I loved these notches oh so much. It is really satisfying when you have notches on pattern pieces, when you're lining things up, to know that everything is absolutely spot on. So there were elements where notches had to line up to each other for the pocket construction, and then they also lined up perfectly onto the trouser leg, both for the front pockets and for the welt pockets. This is part of what made the welt pockets so satisfying to put together, because when I was folding things up, everything was just matching up so beautifully, and all those notches made such a difference. The drafting was clearly spot on to make sure that everything was going to line up just so, and it was really satisfying. They did also have some pieces like in the crotch where there was a bit of an angle for things to line up nicely, areas where things were angled out so when they're folded that they line up well. These are the details that I feel like when you're putting things together, you feel like you're nailing it, you know, like something's lining up and fitting together and you're like, ooh yeah, this is going to come out really neatly, and it just fills you with confidence as you're sewing. The tailors had a fair amount of notches, but they didn't always go together in a way that I would have liked. So for example, the pockets, when they're sewn together, they have notches to match up, and that was great, that was nice, they went together, but then those notches weren't necessarily on the trouser leg. So when you put it onto the trouser, you're like, I think this is right, this seems about right. Particularly with the welt pockets, there were parts where one section of the welt overlaps and then the notches line up, but then when you're putting it onto another piece, it doesn't have those same notches, and it just makes you feel a little bit less sure of what you're doing. There was also a bit with the welt pocket where it's folded up and it's meant to be sticking above the waist seam, and I think there are reasons for that. There is a bit of a curve to the top of that waist, so it might have been a bit of an unusual shape and maybe had to have been a bit more precise with the bottom of the welt to fold up and create that. But it also just felt a little bit like, I hope this is right as I'm sniffing it, because once you sniff it, it's done. It did turn out really well, so I think it was okay. I think there was a rationale for that, but again, it just made me feel a little bit less sure of myself as I was going, but it did come together nicely. And finally, the finishing details, which to me is kind of like the cherry on top. When you sew a garment and it looks just as beautiful from the inside as it does from the outside. All of these had a nice deep 2-inch hem, which I always appreciate. I feel like that works really well for a long trouser, for a wide leg trouser, especially in a drapey fabric. It helps things to fall nicely, but also it just looks really nice and neat. They did all give different methods of how to finish your seams, and generally they recommended serge seam or zigzag seam. I'm going to depend a little bit on what machines you have. But the Rose pants, like I said, they have a whole guide of different seam finishes, and there are parts of the instructions where they suggested this might work well with a flat felled seam, for example. And I think it was nice just to have the option there. The Rose pants on the whole, I finished with serge seams. There's not a huge amount to write home about as far as how these look on the inside. I think they look absolutely fine. One thing that I did like is that when you are putting the waistband onto the inside and folding the bottom of that over, you have it slightly longer than where you're meant to be stitching, so that way when you stitch in the ditch from the outside, you're going to catch all of that seam. I have had patterns before where it's folded just to the length of that seam, and it's really easy to miss parts of it. So I do appreciate that, and I think it did create a really lovely finish on the inside. They also had you stitch along the elastic at the back just to stop it from twisting. Now remember, this is 2 channels of smaller elastic, 3/4 inch elastic. There was an option of doing a 1.5 inch elastic and just leaving it like that, but I wanted to try the 2 smaller channels, which is what's recommended. And I wasn't sure if I would need to do that line of stitching because I wondered with the narrower elastic if it might not shift around as much. It shifted even more, so I am glad that I had those rows of stitching there, and I think it looks really neat on the whole. The tailors had some really beautiful finishing details. One of the things they have you do when you're cutting out your pattern pieces is to cut out some bias strips of your fabric, and that way you can have that along the inside edge of the waistband. I always love that kind of finish on a waistband. I think it looks so beautiful, so nice and neat. And I like that it is included as an assumption that you're going to be having this kind of neat finish. I do also like that that inner waistband piece does extend again a little bit below the seam where you're going to be stitching on the ditch from the outside so that you're guaranteed to catch it. I think it looks great. Now the pockets are meant to be lined with a different lining fabric, but I decided just to use self fabric for these because they were light and drapey fabrics to begin with anyway. I decided there really wasn't any point in using a different fabric that might not fall in quite the same way, and I'm happy with my choices. I think the inside pockets at the front look really lovely. The way they go across to the front, to the center. The front pockets as well are French seamed, so the instructions have you French seam them, and then at the end they tell you if you don't want to do French seam, this is what you can do. But I appreciate that the French seam is the default. I feel like that does just make it that little bit extra special, and it's not a lot to construct them in that way. It's just, you know, a very small part of that you need to construct with French seams. The welt pockets I think look great from the inside as well. I think everything's falling really nice and beautifully. Those pocket bags look really nice and neat. The outside, like I said, I'm a little bit being a perfectionist, but I do see that little row of stitching that I don't think should be visible on the outside, but that is me making a boo-boo, not understanding the instructions. But I think on the whole, these pockets, both front and back, look great. They also did explain where exactly to put your buttonhole and your hook and bar, and I feel like following their instructions, it all sat really nice and neatly, and I'm really happy with how those bits turned out. I like the button that I chose. I didn't have an exact match of the color, but I feel like the color that I chose fits really well, and I am really proud of how these turned out. I think they're a really beautiful tailored pair of trousers. The Mitchells also have a really beautiful finish on the inside, so they also suggested using some bias tape on the inside. They don't have a waistband, but on the bottom of the waist facing, and I think it looks really good. Now I used a different bias tape because they didn't have it as part of their pattern pieces to make your own bias tape, and I only realized later that that was an option when I no longer had any more of that fabric around. So I decided to just use some bias tape that I had that I think is also just a nice detail, and I think it adds a little bit of something. I think it's really pretty, and I think it does just make it feel that little extra special. They also have a bit of a more unusual shape to the fly facing. It extends out, and they suggest putting the buttonhole at a bit of an angle, which is unusual, but I feel like makes it very easy to put on and off. And also I feel like it's just kind of in keeping with the style of these trousers. It's just a little bit different and interesting. You also created like a metered corner fold when you were creating the tabs that get tied, which is such a small detail, but honestly I feel like it just makes things sit together really nicely. You can't see it on the outside, but I do think it does reduce bulk, which is the idea. They did also have you hand stitch your waistband facing to the trouser piece, and I feel like that gives you so much more control and creates a really nice, neat finish. And then there were a few points going around the waist facing where you could either stitch in the ditch or hand stitch things in place. I went with the hand tacking, and I feel like it really does just help everything to sit really beautifully. You cannot see any of those stitches from the outside, and it really does create just such a lovely finish. These pockets I think also look fantastic both from the inside and the outside. I did, again, instead of using a lining fabric, use the self fabric for these, and happy with my choice 100%. I think the welt looks fantastic on the inside. Like I said, I particularly like the look of this welt pocket from the outside, and then my other side pocket from the inside looks beautiful. Now this is where it gets hard, and trying to look at all these factors together, weighing them all up, and trying to figure out where these are now sitting on my leaderboard is pretty challenging. So I think it's really important to recognize that all of these created beautiful trousers, I think they're all really good in the end. I didn't have any major snafus with the construction, but there were a few head scratching moments with the more complicated trouser. The rose were a simpler trouser, but I do also appreciate the nice finishing details that are part of the construction process of the Taylors and the Mitchells. So it's a bit of a like juggle of which things I feel like are more important, weighing them all up. I feel like based on all the things from today and thinking about how things were in the previous round, in third place at the bottom, I'm gonna have to stick the rose pants from Made by Rae. Again, they're not bad. It's just splitting hairs at this point, but I do feel like They were simpler and they look simpler. They're great, but something's gotta give, right? So in second place, I am going to be putting the tailored trousers by BF Patterns. They were not perfect. There were some elements of the instructions, of the construction that were not my favorite, but they are so beautiful on the inside. I think they look so nice, and I really do appreciate that they pushed you for those more like tailored details. In first place is still gonna be the Mitchell trousers by Closet Core because guys, these came together well. I really cannot fault their instructions on the whole. Yes, maybe I would have liked a little bit more information about putting that pocket together, but it came together and it looks fantastic. And I really, really enjoyed the process of making these. Now it is all well and good talking about these pants, but the proof is in the pudding, and that is going to be my next video in this series. I am really excited to see how these all work out in my actual wardrobe. I want to try them on with some different things, see what I think works well and what doesn't. I want to see which of these I feel more comfortable, more confident in, and tell you which one is my ultimate fancy pants. That is going to be coming out as soon as I can get it out to you. A lot of it is going to depend on weather when I have an opportunity to take photos. So watch this space. Hopefully it won't be long. I really hope you enjoyed today's video and getting into the sewing nitty-gritty. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments down below if you agree with some of the things that I liked or didn't like about these patterns, because quite likely you would have found similar things in other patterns as well. If you did like the video today, I would appreciate if you give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see the finale of this video and other upcoming videos. I will see you guys very soon. Bye!